Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the latest data to figure out exactly why your cost of living is rising so sharply right now. We're actually going to look past the usual global headlines to unpack some fundamental structural shifts happening inside the US economy, shifts that are seriously threatening future stability. So let's peel back the layers on a massive economic paradox, taking the data straight from the source. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the US inflation paradox. Second, a pre-existing problem. Third, the oil intensity trap. Fourth, central banks and rates. And finally, political pressure on the Fed. All right, Section 1, the US inflation paradox. Let's kick things off with a pretty wild number, 3.8%. Back in April, headline inflation in the US actually hit 3.8%. And, this wasn't just a random blip in the radar. It marks the highest rate since May of 2023, which made it the highest inflation rate across the entire G7 at that time. When conflict recently erupted in the Middle East, the general assumption was that the US economy would be relatively insulated from it all. But, as we'll see, the data's telling a completely different story. So to figure out why it's so high and where it's actually heading next, we have to look at the Producer Price Index, or PPI. This metric basically measures the inflation that domestic producers are experiencing right now. Why does this matter to your wallet? Well, PPI acts as a canary in the coal mine. It's a highly reliable predictor for future consumer inflation. I mean, if it costs companies more to make a product, you can be absolutely certain they're going to pass those costs right down to you at the checkout counter. And get this, the recent PPI data came in at a staggering 6%. That is the highest it's been since December 2022. This tells us loud and clear that producers are feeling a massive squeeze right now. Because the PPI is essentially a sneak peek of what's to come for regular consumers, this 6% figure strongly signals that more price pain is likely on the horizon for the broader economy. Which brilliantly illustrates the core paradox we're untangling today. If the US is the world's top oil producer, largely thanks to the massive rise of fracking and shale oil over the last decade, and it hardly imports any oil from the Middle East anymore, why in the world is energy inflation hitting America the hardest among its peers? To solve this puzzle, we've got to dig a little deeper into the underlying state of the economy. Moving on to Section 2, a pre-existing problem. If we look at the February data, which is essentially our baseline before recent geopolitical conflicts really disrupted the oil markets, U.S. inflation was already running at 2.4%. That's noticeably hotter than the Federal Reserve's target rate of 2.0%. Compare that to its European peers for a second. Germany was sitting at 1.9%, and France was all the way down at 1.0%. The reality is, the U.S. went into this global energy shock with its inflation engine already revving much higher than the rest of the developed world. Which brings us to Section 3, the oil intensity trap. To really get this, we need to understand a concept called oil intensity. Oil intensity calculates exactly how much oil an entire economy has to consume just to produce a single dollar of GDP. Understanding this completely breaks the illusion that just being a massive oil producer automatically protects your wider economy from global price shocks. Sure, producing oil is great for the energy companies, but if the rest of your incredibly diverse economy relies heavily on burning that fuel just to keep the lights on, you are incredibly vulnerable to price spikes. And here's where the comparison becomes genuinely staggering. The source analysis reveals that the oil intensity of the U.S. economy is roughly twice that of the European Union. Think about that for a second. The American economic machine literally needs significantly more fossil fuels just to maintain its baseline economic output compared to Europe. So when global oil prices shoot up, European economies can sort of lean a bit more on alternative energy sources. The U.S. economy, though? It takes the hit head-on because it relies so heavily on consuming that oil across almost every single sector. Because of this deep-seated reliance, U.S. energy inflation specifically went through the roof. We went from a totally manageable 0.5% in February, zooming up to 12% in March, and then hitting an absolutely incredible 17.9% by April. This easily outpaced the energy inflation seen in the euro area, which came in around 10.9% for April. This steep, aggressive climb, that is exactly what the oil intensity trap looks like in practice. Okay, Section 4, central banks and rates. The source material breaks down the standard theoretical procedure used by independent central banks, like the Federal Reserve, to actually tame inflation. It works like a chain reaction. Step 1, the central bank raises interest rates. Step 2, this makes borrowing money much more expensive for both businesses and everyday consumers. Step 3, Because borrowing is now costly, economic growth intentionally slows down. Step 4, less money circulates in the economy. And finally, step 5, with less money chasing the same amount of goods, inflation drops. It's definitely a painful medicine to swallow, but historically, it's the most effective treatment we've got. Finally, Section 5, political pressure on the Fed. Now, there is a stark, almost unavoidable contrast between economic theory and political reality. Economic theory demands that an independent central bank raises rates to tame inflation without any bias whatsoever. But the political reality? Elected officials notoriously avoid raising rates. Why? Because as we just talked about, raising rates slows down the economy. And purposefully slowing down the economy right before voters head to the polls is typically disastrous for whoever happens to be in power. This creates a massive tug-of-war between doing what is right for long-term inflation and doing what's right for short-term political survival. The source reporting illustrates exactly how this political pressure manifests in the real world. It outlines how Donald Trump has previously pressured Fed leadership regarding interest rates, historically labeling Fed Chair Jerome Powell as acting too late, and even launching investigations into him. Furthermore, the source notes the nomination of Kevin Walsh to the Fed, a figure who has allegedly promised to deliver rate cuts. Regardless of where you stand politically, the data highlights a very clear willingness from the political sphere to exert active influence over central bank policy. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate danger here. The fundamental economic risk outlined in the data is actually quite simple. Forcing the central bank to cut rates to avoid a pre-election economic slowdown, especially while inflation is already running hot, is basically like pouring gasoline on a fire. If you artificially lower the cost of borrowing when inflation is already at that 3.8% mark we discussed earlier, you risk pushing inflation up even further. And that creates deeply destabilizing impacts across the entire U.S. economy. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. As you consider all the data presented in this explainer, the pre-existing hot inflation, the uniquely heavy American reliance on oil, and the looming threat to the Federal Reserve's ability to act objectively, you really have to ask yourself, if political pressures successfully override central bank independence, exactly how high could the cost of living climb in an economy that is so fiercely dependent on oil? It's a complex puzzle for sure, and the outcome will absolutely dictate the economic reality for years to come. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you in the next one.